If a church has no written bylaws, who actually decides what happens when leaders disagree or if they fail?
Then you have chaos, and then it's going to fall into the hands of the people who are running things. Power is the ability to make people do things they don't necessarily want to do. Authority is the legitimized ability to move people forward. So there's a big difference there. You hear this phrase in unhealthy church environments, because I'm the pastor, that's why. You ask a question about a perceived problem, and then you become the problem. You could have good theology, but yet an unhealthy style of communication, which is what we're talking about, poor communication. And this is one of the characteristics of an unhealthy church in general.
Okay, John, well, here we are. This is our 4th episode. I am super excited about this one. We're talking about poor communication.
What'd you say?
We're...
See, that was being ironic.
I didn't get it. Bad on me. So, all right. Do I have to cut? No, I'm just kidding. So yeah, poor communication in cult-like churches, or churches that have cult-like practices. And I'm excited because there's a lot of really good stories here and a lot of great analogies. And I'm going to get right into it. I've got a bunch of questions. Some of them I'm just going to read right off my my list. And are you ready?
Yes, sir.
I've been going to this church a long time, but I came from a seeker-sensitive church before I came here. Mm-hmm. And that was the only other church that I've ever been at. That's where I professed, and I literally became a Christian, got baptized, and all that kind of stuff. And so when I was looking for a new church, I didn't know what to look for. And one of the things that stood out when I found the site is you had bylaws and a
doctrinal statement.
Basically the we believe, and you backed up the we believe with biblical references.
Sure.
So to me, that was, and then the flock groups. Those were my two
small
big
groups. There are small groups.
Yeah, small groups. And so in the seeker church that I was in before, I met weekly with people. But also, even though the church did not have its own, it had a very unstructured leadership. Just had an associate pastor and a pastor. But it was rooted in the Word really well. And they taught good doctrinal disciplines. And so I was fortunate. Many people are not that fortunate to have that the first time they become a believer. I knew what to look for when I was perusing the website and looking for those things that are going to stand out to me. Music, actually, that was a big thing for me. And the church that I was at before, long story short, they played what I called rock and roll. So it was it was contemporary with lots of, it was very loud. That's I come from a rock and roll background. That's all I wanted to do in life. So that was really important to me. But when I came to this church, I discovered that that's not what God thought was important to me. And so I grew to love the music style of this church based on just my own growth, and what God wanted for me. So that being said, I'm going to jump right into the first question, which if a church has no written bylaws, who actually decides what happens when leaders disagree or if they fail? So I guess the real question is why? Why do people accept that?
Yeah, well, like you said, you were looking for certain things in a new church, and a lot of people aren't looking for that. They're not looking for a doctrinal statement. They're not looking for bylaws. And usually bylaws are a document that basically tell how the church is going to run, how big decisions are made, who has the authority, the legitimate power to do things, and what do you do if the church dissolves? It has a lot of different answers for, okay, this is kind of like our constitution. This is our blueprint for a church. This is where we're going to operate. Our operating system is our bylaws. And then usually the doctrinal statement is a section or an article within this larger document of the bylaws. So the doctrinal statement is the stuff, this is what we believe. This is what the Bible says about spiritual things, about the present and future things. So therefore, that just to give a little structure there, you got bylaws, bigger, wider document, doctrinal statement embedded within the bylaws. So, but to respond to your question, a lot of people aren't looking for that unless you've been burned,
Right.
unless you've learned the hard way. And so if absent of a document, absent of some objective source of truth in terms of how to operate, then it's going to be we're going to just go by the seat of our pants. And of course,
you said it right there, the objective source. And that's when you have something that is not, somebody can easily say, look, don't trust me. This is what we're going by.
Absolutely, yeah. So the bylaws. Okay, so this is what we're going to do. This is normal. Like for example, if we're going to spend more than 1.5% of the budget, like we have this one mention in our bylaws, if we spend more than 1.5% of the budget, the congregation has to approve of that expenditure. Or if we're going to do a building program, or if we're going to elect elders or a new senior pastor. Now, our bylaws give a lot of latitude to the elders and to the staff. But then on the really big things, you got to get kind of some group involvement, I think. And so we kind of almost have a modified congregation rule church on the really big issues that the church faces. So, but your question is, what happens when they're not followed? Yeah, then you have chaos, or if you don't have bylaws, you also have the potential for chaos too, and then it's going to fall into the hands of the people who are running things, which is usually the elders and or the pastor or whoever it might be, as a group or an individual.
So, and that can cascade into where you have lots of other issues when you have one or two people in control of everything.
Right. And then so then where does that power come from? And in political science terms, remember, there's a difference between power and authority. Okay, power is the ability to make people do things they don't necessarily want to do. Authority is the legitimized ability to move people forward. So there's a big difference there. And so
I've
you
heard
want
that analogy as a traffic cop, right? He doesn't have the power to stop traffic, but he has the authority because of the badge and what it represents.
Yeah. So everybody agrees, or at least most people agree, okay, we're all on the same page that this guy has the responsibility actually to make these decisions because we all agree. And so therefore it's authority and not power. But then when you fall into a chaotic environment where, okay, we don't have any written rules, then you go by the seat of your pants. And so then you get into a scenario where one's authority is coming from his position. And in kind of biblical terms, that would be authority ex cathedra, meaning out of the chair.
Gotcha.
Okay, so therefore, because I'm the pastor, and you hear this phrase in unhealthy church environments, because I'm the pastor, that's why.
Right.
And so therefore, that's ex cathedra, which is because I sit in this chair because of my title of pastor or whatever, or bishop. Therefore, I have the power to be able to make decisions and make people do things that they don't necessarily want to do. Now, they might be on board, but they may not. And so therefore, it's but authority comes ex scriptura, where this person has been examined. This person, we ordain him because he's been examined to be a godly man, or these men have been deemed to be godly men. And so therefore, we recognize the authority that God has already given to them because they've been examined. And so therefore, they have authority now to make decisions either individually or as a group.
Okay, that's really good. Let's jump on to the second one. This is kind of an obvious one, but what does it say about a church's theology of authority? You're just talking about authority. If the questions are treated as threats rather than somebody wanting to simply get clarity.
Yeah. This is a big one.
And you've experienced that, right?
Oh yeah. So basically, in an unhealthy church environment, you can ask questions, but there's usually you pay a price for asking a question because
Right.
you ask a question about a perceived problem, and then you become the problem. And this is where things go really bad. And it's also under the category of unwritten rules. It doesn't say anywhere that I'm not allowed to ask a question, and I'm used to asking questions at my work, in my family, with my friends. And why can't I ask you, my pastor or my elder, why can't I ask you a question? Why did you react that way? And it goes also under the category, as I said, of unwritten rules, where you don't know you've broken a rule until you've broken it,
Right.
because you never knew it was a rule to begin with,
Right.
you know.
Right.
But to respond to your question,
Yeah. What does it say about a church's theology?
if questions are treated as threats rather than invitations to clarity, well, it doesn't necessarily say anything about their theology. You see, that's the whole point of the unhealthy churches. They're churches with actually pretty good theology.
Right.
I'm not talking about, now you get this in full-blown cults too, in totalistic or non-totalistic cults.
Sure.
Remember, a totalistic cult is where you're actually living there on a compound and you're immersed 24/7. And then a non-totalistic cult group is one that you interact with all society, but you belong to an organization that believes some pretty weird, unbiblical things. But we're talking about another category of churches that have good theology, but they have bad orthopraxy. They have good
Right.
orthodoxy, but bad orthopraxy. So you could have good theology, but yet an unhealthy style of communication, which is what we're talking about, poor communication within, and this is one of the characteristics of an unhealthy church in general, where questions are treated as threats rather than, oh yeah, you can ask a question. Like in our core values, our church, for example, we have one of the core values is transparency in finances. So any member of the church, any official member of the church can ask our treasurer any question about finances and then expect an answer in a timely fashion.
Right.
They can ask questions about, hey, how much does John make? Or how much does what do we spend on electricity a month?
Yeah.
You're allowed to ask those questions because you're a member. So therefore, we have transparency. We don't necessarily make everything automatically public, but if you ask a question, you should expect a reasonable answer within a reasonable period of time with a godly attitude behind it as opposed to a begrudging attitude. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
You see, that's healthy versus unhealthy. And unfortunately, the unhealthy practices are too numerous.
So let's talk about accountability. When you have churches that don't have accountability, what happens? And then what's the reverse of that? With a healthy church, what happens when you do have accountability?
By accountability, do you mean that who do I answer to? Like
That sounds like it makes sense.
Who could overrule me? Whatever.
Right.
Yeah. Good. Okay. So everybody needs a boss.
And can you give me a couple of really good references, like biblical references with respect to accountability?
Yeah. Well, I mean, any time in the New Testament where church leadership is discussed, for example, Paul always appointed elders, a plurality of elders. So they're all accountable to each other, individually to the group. The Old Testament, really interesting example, would be the kings. I'm glad you asked this. That's a good question.
That's cool.
Because the kings of Israel were very unique. Now, the kings of all of the other people groups in ancient times was the sovereign. I mean, anything he could do anything he wanted to do. He could break any rule he wanted to do. He was the rule himself. He was law. So, but then Israel came online, and Israel was very different. There were some limitations for the kings. For example, they couldn't own a certain amount of animals, horses in particular. They had to also, they were accountable to the prophets. The prophets were the ones who attempted to hold the kings accountable. So there was a checks and balances. And our founding fathers, that's where they got that idea from of checks and balances is Israel. It's one of the many examples of how the Bible influenced the founding of our nation.
Wow.
So the kings still had a lot of power. They had a lot of authority, but yet it was limited and they were held accountable by the prophets. That's like a big chunk of the Old Testament. The prophets openly criticizing the kings.
Right.
Now, a lot of the kings were ungodly, so they fought back, but yet that was the system.
Mm-hmm.
So accountability is important because we all need a boss. So like on our elder board, we're all accountable to each other. I'm the only elder who's compensated. So in terms of my compensation, they set that. I don't determine how much I get paid. They set that for me, and I'm accountable. If I don't do my job, they're going to say something, and that's expected. But then if one of the other elders went offline a little bit, out of line, then we would hold him accountable too. So the group holds the individual accountable. In an unhealthy system, there's not too much of that. That's the big distinction there. They don't have a boss. And in a lot of unhealthy churches, the pastor is actually the one who sets his own salary. To me, that's insane because you're also opening that person up to accusations and vulnerabilities that Satan would love to get in that crevice. And so therefore it actually is everyone benefits when someone has a boss,
That's cool. Okay, let's talk about blind spots.
Sure.
So one of these questions I have talks about when you have top-down leadership or from the pulpit, a lot of these blind spots nobody knows about until they're revealed. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, this is one of the characteristics that I found in my research as people answered from their experiences in an unhealthy church environment. Okay, so communication is poor because it's usually only top down and not ever bottom up, or rarely bottom up. In other words, we don't really care what you think. We'll never ask you questions to give an authentic, frank response because we already know the answer.
Right.
So why should we bother asking you a question? You know what I mean? So there's never a request for feedback, whether from the group or whether from individuals. For example, like we're about to start a building program, phase 3, and we are definitely, and we've announced this, that we're going to be asking you guys for input. We want to hear what you think. That's not a guarantee that we're going to use everybody's idea, but some pretty good ideas can come from the population, so therefore we're going to make an effort to listen to you. And so communication is top down because the needs of leadership are more important than the group. So what was your question again?
The question was the blind spots.
The blind spots. Yeah, the blind spots appear when bad things happen.
So the blind spots would actually end up being the product of unhealthy communication and the the hidden agendas of the leadership.
Yes, when bad things happen, what happens in an unhealthy church relationship? This brings up something else about communication too, because so the leadership makes a decision, never consults the congregation or asks questions, and they make a decision, and it doesn't go well, and the blind spot is revealed. That's, well, you never asked us. You never asked us even to confirm your decision. Okay, that's at the very least. Like in our church, what we do is the elders, the pastors come up with a question, like a budget or a building program, and then the congregation's asked to confirm it, yes or no, or abstain. So when things don't go well, okay, I'm glad you asked this question because it brings out a lot. When things don't go well, whose fault is it then? Then what they do is they use false guilt and blame is then communicated to the church for failures and disappointments of the church decision. It's like you guys just didn't care enough. You were rebellious because you didn't follow through with what the giving goals were or the attendance goals. Right. I've seen this too. This blows my mind because it's like the church is chastised for not fulfilling the goals set by the leadership. Now, how do you motivate people? And they use false guilt and shame to respond to decisions that they were never part of in the first place.
Right.
Bam. So that's a big characteristic of an unhealthy church system when you see that happening. We never asked your opinion. We didn't even ask you to confirm it. And when it didn't turn out, it's your fault. So what's that, gaslighting?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So you have definitely had experience with spiritual maturity and submission. Can you like give me a couple of examples where you see that came to fruition in a negative way?
Yes, it would be the constant drumbeat of scriptural passages on the issue of rebellion, submission. Okay, so basically you hear a lot of preaching and teaching about the importance of submitting to church leadership, which we should do, but we don't have to be constantly reminded of that. And because they're trying to send you a message, submit, submit, submit. And the whole idea of submission in the New Testament, the word is hupotasso, and it means that is something, and it's in the middle voice, which means it's something I do to myself. So, but what they're doing is they're constantly reminding you that you need to do that. And I remember one time when our previous church was going through the big church split situation, and the pastor actually got an outside speaker to come to speak about the idea of how you should submit to the church leadership.
Oh my gosh.
Because he wanted somebody else to come in to back him up. It was kind of sad, but yet he did that. And everybody saw how manipulative it was. So, of course we should teach on that. Of course we should voluntarily submit ourselves to our leadership. But to be constantly reminded of that is something else.
Yeah.
So
no, that's good stuff.
So you're spiritually mature if you submit, if you ask a question or, or vote no, which should be your prerogative, because otherwise, why are you asking me to vote if I can't vote no? But the healthy thing looks like you just have gobs of trust, going both ways. You just have, because we're trying to love the other person. The church leadership loves the people and serves the people like Christ did. And that is part and parcel of unhealthy church leadership. What it does is it says, okay, so the entity exists for my benefit, and so therefore it's here to serve me. But what Christ did was he still had the authority, obviously, but he existed for the entity. In fact, to the point to where he died for the group. He died for the church, right? So he turned things right side up, whereas most human leadership is like, hey, I'm in charge now, so this is all about me, and I'm going to get what I want out of it. So that's very ungodly leadership. So you see that style of leadership in unhealthy churches. And a lot of it comes out in the topic we're talking about in this episode, which is poor communication. There's a reason why I'm not asking questions. There's a reason why you're not allowed to ask questions. There's reasons why the communication is mainly top down and never, ever bottom up. Another core value that we have in our church that we actually use too, we have our doctrinal statement and our core values. And the core value is that many times ministries are initiated from the grassroots.
Sure.
Because people have really good ideas. And that doesn't mean that we just let anybody do whatever they want anytime they want. So someone comes up for an idea of a small group. In fact, several of our small groups, it came from the grassroots.
Yeah, let me tell you how that really happens, John.
Yeah.
When you see something like that,
Sure.
what happens is somebody says, that's a great idea. You're in charge of that idea.
That's right. They don't know that that's coming over the hill, though. But that is our next response. So it's like the whole thing is I'm trying to build what healthy communication looks like, contrast it to the poor communication in an unhealthy church. Not just talk about the negative, but also the positive. The ideal is this way, and this is the way it should be. But in cult-like churches, it's not that way.
So let's talk about something kind of cool, power and authority. So in the absence of bylaws and also doctrinal statements, a church will quietly shift away from like a shared stewardship to like a personality-driven church. And we're in Texas. The Bible Belt, we see those all over the place.
Right.
Personality-driven churches. And then what happens is a lot of these personalities, they become popular. And so, and that happens both ways. Just like politics, people get extreme on either side of that. And so I guess let's talk about that a little bit, the personality-driven mentality.
Cult of personality, it's called. in politics and church, any organization has can have a cult of personality, and it's okay. It's okay that these guys are popular. There's no problem with popularity if you have accountability. That's fine. There's a lot of really great pastors out there and ministry leaders who are very popular, like a Chuck Swindoll, for example.
Sure.
The guy, but he's smart enough to know that he needs other men in his life to hold him accountable, to encourage him, and to take care of problems before they become problems, and
Right.
another set of eyes and ears. It's a win-win, really, when you have other men to whom you're accountable.
Yeah.
But what happens is that you get a cult of personality to where, again, their power comes from their position out of the ex cathedra.
Mm-hmm.
I mentioned this before, didn't I?
Yeah.
And so that's the problem right there. When I'm the pastor, that's why.
Dovetailing that into a pastor who says, "Hey, I'm accountable to God." What? Let's talk about some of like the negative consequences of the whole community, the whole congregation.
Mm-hmm. Yes, for the ones who are accountable to God,
the ones who actually say, "No, I'm accountable to God, not to you."
Yes, that's a very frequent phenomenon where they say, you should not mess with the Lord's anointed. It's like, okay, and what does that do to the audience? It's like, okay, he's the Lord's anointed, and so he's the chosen one, so therefore we better not mess with him. And so again, your authority is coming from your position or your seat, not out of Scripture. And those are dangerous grounds. So you have power, which is the ability to make people do things that they don't necessarily want to do, but you don't have authority, which is legitimized power by other men who transferred or recognized that in you. And so therefore you're legitimized to be able to do things. And then at the same time, you're also continually accountable to people too.
Right.
So if you say something crazy like that, like do this because I'm the pastor, that's why. And also, when you have to remind people that you're in charge, you're not really in charge.
Right. I heard this. If a man leadeth and has no followers, he's just taking a walk.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so let's talk about fear. That's a big deal. I mean, I've heard some really, I won't say terrifying stories, but I mean, I guess they are terrifying, when
Right.
people get so fearful of anything in a church. And there are many different levels of fear. So, in a lot of times that comes out of what I would say a silent environment. Things just keep happening. Nobody's talking about it. It makes everybody fearful in any different level of a church, from leadership all the way down to just somebody who's coming on Sundays. Do you want to talk about like maybe the different types of fear there are?
Yeah, lots of times, you see, and I brought this out in one of the previous episodes, unhealthy church practices, it's not just the fault of the leadership. The followership is also complicit. And to some extent, people actually like this because it takes a lot of work and burden off of them. So they're more than willing to follow because we delegate a lot of stuff out in our lives. We don't grow our own food. We don't make our own clothes. We don't build our own houses.
Right.
We don't even we send our dry cleaning out. We don't want to do that. We get somebody to do our lawn, everything. I'm not criticizing that specifically. It's just that now we're also delegating out our spiritual lives.
Right.
So we like it when we have a powerful leader who is very confident. And so people who are new in the faith, people who are weaker personalities, they are especially vulnerable to powerful, strong leaders. And so therefore, they're also more vulnerable to being hurt. And so they stay silent, and as a result, they're complicit in that environment. And so they don't speak up because they're afraid of being deemed rebellious because they've heard that sermon the last 6 weeks that they are to be submissive to church leadership. Again, it's a biblical truth, but if that's all you hear, it's being overworked. You know what I mean? So they're a fear of being rejected from the group. They also have a fear of being considered disloyal to the group. And so they don't want to do that because they want to stay within the graces of the group.
Yeah,
and the
everybody wants
leader.
to be involved.
Of course. And so they have the fear, they have FOMO, fear of missing out. Those are some of the manifestations of their fears. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
You know, with rejection, disloyalty, being disobedient to God because they're asking a question or they have an idea they want, and they're getting the pushback of not getting an answer, and also a negative reaction. Why are you asking that question? You know, don't you trust us? Don't you trust us? Something like that is said. I've heard that before.
Yeah.
Or you could just go. I've heard that too. In a church split situation where a lot of people saw things in a congregational meeting that was very, very ungodly. And like people's names being dragged through mud and so on like that. And so then groups of people or individuals would go to the elders to say, hey, look, you know, this is what I saw with my own two eyes. It's not gossip. It's stuff I experienced. And they were told, just go, just leave.
Wow.
You know, and so in terms of but the worst thing that could happen is you're actually being cast out. And then also the misuse of church discipline is another big one too. I've seen that too.
With respect to fear?
Yeah, people are afraid of it because they see somebody else who is cast out. Not because they were in sin so much, even though the person's not perfect, but rather there was a preemptive strike done against people who were starting to ask questions. I saw this with a deacon in one church where he was a deacon, so he had this responsibility to evaluate the finances, and he saw some discrepancies, and so he was just asking questions. He shouldn't have done that. And so what the pastor did was he called up the pastors of this guy's two previous churches from years ago when he lived in different places. And so supposedly he got information about this man that was negative from these two previous churches. And it's kind of doubtful because he went to those churches for many years. And then he spread that bad information, that negative information within the current church.
Wow. That
this guy was just rebellious, and his track record was this is what he did in these previous churches. And so it was like, so before he could actually get to the point of finding out whether or not these discrepancies were real or not, he was already discredited by a big section of the church because it was spread through the church. It went like wildfire. You know, it's gossip. So the guy's reputation was already pre-discredited before he actually came to a conclusion. And I have seen this happen and reported in churches. And it's
so funny because it just reminds me of life in general. I see people work so hard to avoid doing the right thing where the right thing would have actually been less work. You know,
that's true.
Less in the big picture, less work. All right, let's end this on a positive note. So let's talk about really, really good communication in a church. And I've been at this church for a long time, and I've seen some really, really good stuff from the top down. And you know, I've seen a lot of leaders grow in the church and take on different leadership roles. And it's really encouraging, to be honest. And want to just talk about that and how you kind of want to foster that kind of relationship in general.
Yeah.
And I don't want to don't focus on this church, just focus on in general, because we're not perfect, right?
Of course. Yeah. So I think we've talked a little bit about what the healthy style looks like, and always err on the side of grace too, and transparency. Because sometimes, well, should we tell people this or not? And so, or should we have a vote on this or not? And so what we usually do is err on the side of, let's just have the vote, even though it might seem a little bit overdoing it, but we don't want to be accused of not consulting the congregation and asking them to give their thumbs up or thumbs down on this issue.
Right.
So therefore you err on the side of transparency and grace. And then you also invite people to communicate too. And when they do, you graciously receive them, even if they're a little bit angry. You absorb the hit. It's like Christ did that. It's like a gentle answer turns away wrath, Proverbs 15:1. So it's how you deal with problems, because there will always be problems. That's a constant. But the variable is how do you respond to them? See, so because they're definitely going to come up. You can never guarantee that you're going to be problem free. So it's how you, and then also, so it's how you respond to things, but it's also how you initiate communication. Like, for example, and I know you don't just want to talk about Bear Creek, but it's been my experience for 33 years, so it's what I have, well, in recent years anyway. So, like, for example, we do an annual report every year. It's like 25 pages of detail.
And I will say that you get very hurt when people don't read.
Yeah. I know. I even put a little Easter egg in there to see if people respond. And,
that's great.
You know what I mean? But so you go out of your way to communicate information that they don't even want. You know what I mean? And so you can never be accused. But it shows enthusiasm for what's going on in the church. You know, and you report the good, the bad, and the ugly. You report, hey, these are all the good things. These are a couple disappointments, and these are the plans for next year. And you know, we would appreciate your support in these areas and your involvement and your giving and other areas, prayer. But you know, this is what we have planned, and so we're going to trust the Lord. So we expect you to walk by faith, and so we as a group, we're also going to walk by faith. You know, so it's just being a servant. It's like I said before, it's real important that we follow the leadership style of Jesus in this, and communication is a big part of any leader, whether it's good or bad, right? So therefore, we have to serve the congregation and not expect them to serve us. That's what leaders do. That's what really biblical leaders do. We serve, we sacrifice. That's what a husband's supposed to do for his wife. He still has the authority. It's not like he's a doormat. No, but he serves, and then it's reasonable then for her to follow. And it kind of greases the skid for her to follow, just like the church, any group, a corporation, you know, a school board, whatever the entity is, the leaders are supposed to serve and even sacrifice for the good of the entity. Otherwise, it's not biblical leadership. And unfortunately, that bad style of leadership is characteristic of many churches.
Right. Well, that's good. Well, let's close it out. We were supposed to close it out on a positive note, and you ended on a negative note. So. Just kidding. So no, that's really good. That's a good analogy. And I think this church is a pretty good example. At least, you know, obviously it's not perfect, but the communication is super important. So it's a good one.
Thanks.
It's a done deal.
All right.